hydroponics, and welcome to another episode of the Future of Farming Today, where we discuss the current and future problems of agriculture and how we can help solve it, especially if we all work together. Now, in this episode, I want to talk a little bit about climate change and how it's affecting, and globalization is affecting agriculture, right? So, there's specifically want to talk about rising pest and disease pressure in agriculture, right? So, as we all know, like insects and funguses and weeds, those are all like common problems that have been around forever, for ages and ages. And it's always been something that the farmers have been focused on and improving. Because if you don't handle the weeds, if you don't handle the insects, if you don't handle fungi, then you're going to have a much less yields and much lower crop yields and less money in your pocket, obviously, right? So let's start with what is rising disease and pest pressure, right? So those things, this rising disease and pest pressure, really has to do with a variety of different factors, right? It's an improvement and increase in the damage that these things can cause to your crops. Now, obviously, the one of the main things we talk about and hear a lot about is climate change, right? And whether you're a climate change activist or you're not a big fan of the whole climate change things, or you believe these various things about it, climate change is a factor. Our climate is changing, whether it's global warming due to man-made causes or natural causes, what have you. But as the weather kind of warms up a bit, and it has been on a warming trend over the last 20, 30 years, as the weather warms up, that means insects get more active, right? It also means weeds can grow faster. And in humid environments, it means that fungi can grow and be more of a problem as well. In fact, we have several farms where we've tested our crop booster where after a torrential rain, all of the untreated crops in the region basically had these funguses that destroyed 70, 80, 90% of the crops for the farmers, and the farmers were wiped out that year. Luckily, the farmers that had our technology were protected. They only lost about 15% of their crops, right? But climate change is a big factor, right? Another big factor that can cause disease pressure is the importing of disease. Globalization over the last 30, 40 years has really changed the dynamics of agriculture. In fact, I can point out an example here in Florida where, at the beginning of the year 2000s, we had an import of a new virus, a new disease, right? Called HLB, or Huang Long Bing, right? Or a yellow dragon, they called it, right? But the disease itself is a bacterium that was carried by a psyllid. A psyllid is a type of insect that was carried in on, the eggs of which were carried in on these cultivars. So they basically imported this new variety of citrus, and as they planted them in the fields, these eggs from the larvae and the eggs from the fields were you know, were a problem. They hatched, and of course, these psyllids came in. Well, the problem with it is the psyllids in Asia, where they came from, they have their natural defenses. There's natural predators, animals that eat these and feed on these insects. There's natural, maybe weather patterns that sort of keeps the insect populations in check, right? But here in Florida, where this insect was not native, those natural checks and balances were not in place. So within a few years, these insects multiplied very rapidly and started to become a huge problem. Now, the real issue with that is these insects carried a disease, a bacteria. And when the bacteria gets onto a citrus tree, which happens when the insects eat the leaves, the citrus tree gets this bacterium, and it causes this disease in the tree, and this trees will eventually die. To give you an idea of how much this affects citrus here in Florida, 80% of the production has been lost since the year 2006 to now. So, in other words, in 2005, 2006, before the onset of this disease, they were producing, um, you know, 4 times more produce, more citrus than they do now. And it's been a huge problem they haven't fully been able to solve, even now, almost 20 years later. So it's been a huge problem. Well, all this came from globalization. We can look at smallpox and other diseases in humans. I mean, this is globalization. As things move from one environment to another, they can actually cause huge problem. They can multiply at a rate where there's no natural checks to keep these populations at bay. And you can have a lot more weeds or a lot more insects or a lot more fungi that would normally be resistant. Right? So that's another factor. Another factor is changes in agricultural practices. When you use a lot of chemicals, or when you really start to deplete the health of the plants or the health of the soil, you can make these populations weak. Again, for new diseases or adaptations of a disease, it can really be a problem. If you're monoculture or monocropping, in other words, growing the same crop in your fields year over year over year, and you're not doing a cover crop or mixing different kinds of crops in that same field, again, the fact that you're putting that same genetic pattern over and over again, you can get a bacterium or a virus or an insect that, again, maybe is not native to that area or maybe comes in from somewhere. And because they're all in the same area, there's no genetic diversity to help, nature take its course and resist some of these infections or infestations. So that can be a big problem too. That's why we recommend, most of our farmers, if they're able to do a cover crop or at least take care of their soil with some biological amendments that will improve the genetic diversity in the soil and in the fields, right? That's a big thing. So, I mean, these different factors are a big reason why farmers are having trouble, right? So, what happens when these insects become a problem? Well, the question is, well, how do we prevent these problems, or how do we change this so it's not happening, so the farmers are protected? Well, the short-term solution, of course, has always been using chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides, chemical fungicides, and on a short-term basis, those things can work and can handle some of these pests. But the problem with that method is it creates long-term problems where then the natural beneficial microbiology in soil is decreased, is actually reduced, or you have imbalances where now the plants cannot get the nutrients that they need because that microbial population is imbalanced. And over the long period of time, that soil becomes less and less fertile, right? And that becomes a problem because now the farmer has to spend a lot of money on fertilizers and everything else, right? We recommend using more regenerative, sustainable progresses or processes, like improving biological amendments in the soil, like making sure your microbial populations are in good balances. And there's soil tests you can do that will tell you exactly what those balances are and what you might need to do to balance it out. You have predatory insects and predatory animals that can feed off of destructive insects or destructive fungi, and that will help keep some of these populations in check. And you can also use animals. Again, sometimes we recommend, if you have the ability, to let cattle run through and graze on some of the weeds that you might have in your soil, because if they can keep the weeds in check, right, without herbicides, but they also defecate in the field, which creates a natural fertilizer with natural microbial populations, which will again feed it in a more regenerative way. Now, these types of processes maybe not something you can immediately employ on your farm wholesale, but if you start to incorporate these practices year over year, a little bit at a time, you're going to start to notice big differences in the reduction of your insect populations, right? Your reductions in your fungal populations and reductions in your weed populations as well. And we have a lot of farmers that tell us that, yeah, it might be a 5 or even 10 year process to move from a completely chemical based agricultural system to a completely regenerative or organic one, but that transition is going to make you a lot more money. In fact, some of our farmers tell us that for them it's not about yield, it's not about how many bushels of corn per acre they get. It's more a matter of how cost effective that is, because they're not spending, you know, five, six, $800 on pesticides and fertilizers and all these inputs. They're only spending maybe half of that. Well, that gives them a lot more leeway. So instead of having to get 200, 250 bushels of corn per acre, maybe now they can make more money by only producing 100 to 150, right? And we've seen that in a lot of areas, right? Even in berries and other types of crops as well. So sometimes it's not all about yield. I mean, we look at that, the top line revenue, of course, is always important, but sometimes if we're looking at the cost benefit, it might be more profitable for you to actually produce less but higher quality and with less inputs, right? Now, there's a lot of statistics we can share with you, but really I just wanted to leave you with this idea that if you really take the long term, long range approach, you can actually become a lot more profitable as a farming operation. And you won't need to worry about government subsidies or kickbacks or any of these other types of things, which are not very reliable. And you don't have the problem where the rising cost of inputs, like it happened in the last couple of years, puts you at effect where you're actually losing money for 2 years because of the things that you can't control, like supply chain issues or other types of things that can cause your input cost to skyrocket. Well, if you're doing it in a more organic, natural way, those input costs are not going to be such a problem, and you're going to be making money hand over fist while everybody else is maybe not even able to farm. So they're not able to afford it. In fact, I've talked to some almond growers in California that have literally are tearing out their almond groves because they literally just can't afford to farm anymore. They said, "Look, I would love to farm, but I can't afford to have all these almond groves because it's costing us too much money. We're not making enough money on the other side." So take a look at regenerative agriculture, take a look at naturals, and of course, take a look at our crop booster because, our whole mission is to help farmers not only produce healthier, better quality food, but to do so more profitably. And if you want to put more money in your pocket at the end of the day and not worry so much about that top line revenue number that only is actually going to give you a very small profitability or small return on investment on the end of the day, you can give us a call at 727-324-6750 or email us at service@harvestharmonics.com. We would love to work with you to help make your operation more regenerative, more profitable, and of course, ready for the future so that you can become part of the future of farming today. Talk again